And so I was working
Awesome.
at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at NASA, and the whole experience was like out of a science fiction movie.
So we're back today with another interview with a data scientist, and we're fortunate enough to have Vivek here with us. So Vivek is on the founding team at Multitudes, and he's a co-founder, executive director at Good Data Institute. Why don't you kick us off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
So, hi, I'm Vivek, a data scientist by profession, I guess, but my personal background, I was born in New Delhi and then moved to New Zealand when I was about 5 and grew up in central Auckland. In my professional life, been a data scientist for about 7 years, I think now. Started off in a startup and moved to Melbourne to pursue a PhD. And right now I'm on the founding team of Multitudes. It's a venture-backed startup in Australia, funded by Blackbird. And we're using data to create more inclusive and higher performing engineering teams. And the way we do that is we measure behavioral data on how teams work. So we plug into tools like Jira and GitHub and then provide recommendations and analytics on performance and culture within a team. A lot of focus on Multitudes is around data on people and measuring it in an ethical way. So that's something we think a lot about. And then Good Data Institute is another organization that I co-founded, which is a charity which has a community of data scientists that build data capabilities for the not-for-profit sector. And then I like to eat food, I guess, outside and travel and play a couple of sports.
So I guess before we dive into all the exciting things you're working on now, take us a little bit back as to what you studied at university, why.
Yeah, sure. So in undergrad, I did a double degree. So one of them was an engineering honors degree, specializing in a subfield called engineering science. It's a pretty niche field. It's not offered in a lot of schools, but it was largely focused on optimization and continuum mechanics, so modeling systems. This was early 2010, so data science was like in its very nascent days, but actually it was quite similar to the stuff that we were learning. And then also did a Bachelor of Science, double majoring in statistics and physics. I think the way I got into that from high school, my dad is just a big science buff. And so naturally that inspired a curiosity for my brother and I growing up. Personally, I had a big tendency and inclination towards physics and maths. And so engineering was a natural next step. One thing I thought some engineering programs lacked was a bit of the first principles and foundational skills around mathematics and like probability and statistics. And so I wanted to pick up that through a science degree. And I was also really curious about quantum mechanics and astrophysics and astronomy, always like really into space growing up. And those courses aren't offered in Auckland at the university in an engineering program. And so that was a good way to also just learn about some cool stuff.
So was it a 4-year or a 5-year degree?
A 5-year program. The engineering degree is 4 years and then the science degree is 3 years. But when you do them together, you do some extra papers and you get
and which was the harder one? Was it engineering or sciences?
That's a really good question. If I was to say like on pure like difficulty, some of those like pure mathematics courses that I did were really, really hard. And it was just some stuff that you just didn't understand and you had to sit there for hours on end and then you finally understood something. But overall, like the volume of work, engineering was just like a lot of stuff, especially in like 3rd and 4th year. You had large group projects or really big deliverables. You had an honors thesis. And so very like practical, high workload, but I think maybe not as difficult as some of the really tough courses in the sciences degree.
And I guess everything you did with kind of sciences, maths, etc. How did you find your way into data science, or what were kind of the range of careers you were weighing up between?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what it's like in Australia, but in New Zealand, you have to do 800 hours as part of your engineering degree before you can graduate of work experience.
Is that about
and
3?
My first one I did at a FMCG called Foodstuffs. So they operate the equivalent of Coles, I guess, in New Zealand and pricing work. And then the second one, I actually did at a tech startup as a data analyst / scientist. And that's how I got into it. Really fortuitously fell into the job. I actually knew a friend who was working there. I asked her, hey, like I need to finish my hours. Do you have any internship positions? And she's like, no, we don't. 6 months later, I randomly got a Facebook message from her, and she's like, hey, like I need some help on some stuff, and like maybe we can get you some data science experience as well. And this was like 2015, 2016, where data science was really like coming into the conversation, And I wanted to be attached to like this new cool thing. And yeah, really like luckily fell into that role. And it was an amazing first job. I stayed around there after university and was paired up with a pretty senior data scientist in New Zealand who I got to learn the ropes from. So yeah, that was kind of how I fell into it.
That seems like very similar to a lot of stories I hear from people that were doing data science at the time, like myself included, where like there was nothing to study to actually get into data science, where, okay, you have engineering background, you do a little bit of problem solving, great. Like, we'll teach you everything you need to know on the job. So how did you find it being a data scientist in a startup environment? Because these days there's such a big variation in data science as a discipline between corporate, startups, etc. So keen to hear your kind of unique take there.
Yeah, totally. So I've worked at a couple of startups now, and I guess the most exciting aspect of it is you get to take something from ideation, concept, prototyping, all the way to production, and then eventually the customers, and then iteration on that. And so that iteration cycle of getting feedback from actual users is very fast, and you're able to accelerate like kind of the development of your data product. You really learn a lot about prioritization, radically prioritizing, to be honest, and making trade-offs. Unless you're working at a company or a startup where the core product is innovating in terms of like machine learning or modeling or AI, a lot of the work you're going to do is going to be taking things that already work and connecting pipes together. And so probably one thing I would say is you do have to accept that you're not going to get necessarily the bandwidth you might at a large company to read literature and understand like what's the top of the like what's the most hottest model out there right now, and I want to play around with it because realistically, like, you're running on a very low cash flow and the business just needs stuff going to customers that's going to add value straight away. And so you learn to appreciate that data science is so much more than just building machine learning models and coding them into production. And you get to learn everything else. And probably the one thing is you start to appreciate the plumbing work that goes into building a data product. So spending hours on data cleaning, writing unit tests, sometimes you might be managing social media for the company because the operations person's on leave. And so a variety and diaspora of different experiences that you'll probably go through at a startup.
I love it.
But really that like 0 to 1 experience is pretty intangible, I think.
That's amazing. And tell us a little bit about your work at Multitudes. I'm guessing it's still at a startup phase right now.
We're on a closed beta program. It's a really hard question to say like what I do at Multitudes because I swear it changes like every week. Like my job description or what I'm meant to be doing, I guess, is as a data scientist, a lot of my work is being responsible for building the metrics we have in the platform, prototyping new things. So playing around in Jupyter notebooks or building small shiny applications and showing them to customers or to the team to understand like how we build things. And also like creating and executing on our R&D strategy. So one thing that we do is we're looking at how teams collaborate and how they perform. And so the data we measure is really actually quite personal towards the businesses that we work with, because we might be saying like this team's doing more work than another team. And obviously that can stimulate a lot of conversations. And so the way we measure the data and report that data can actually influence how people behave, because no one wants to have a metric about themselves or their team looking badly. And so data ethics is actually a huge piece of work that we have to like think about. And how do we honor the principles of data ethics? And that's probably like my core responsibility. But because there's a startup, there's 1,000 other things you do. So doing user research interviews, prototyping things on Figma sometimes, running our go-to-market initiatives, running our community, creating the community, representing multitudes at like sales events or talking to investors, and just like a whole lot more. And I personally really love that breadth that you get, but also the ability to go quite deep at the same time when you need to. So a whole range of things and hard to answer, I guess.
No, it seems like you're wearing quite a few hats at the same time, and it seems like you're getting a lot of value and enjoyment out of that, which is pretty amazing. I feel like it takes a very unique person to succeed in startup environments where it's almost kind of like a well laid out path in corporate if you are doing data science and if you're doing other types of profession, where in startup you're kind of doing a real trial by fire, Right.
You have to be very comfortable with the uncertainty and really like making trade-offs and accepting that sometimes you might just make a decision and you execute on it and it's just a complete wrong decision. Accepting that you just made the wrong bet and really quickly like moving on to the next thing. And having comfort in that it's okay to screw up as long as you learn something from it. And like next time you're not going to make the same mistake again. So
I love that.
risk taking is a skill, I guess, that you learn to be comfortable with.
Having been in the data science stream and career for a while, what do you think is the best way to get started these days?
Yeah, this is a really good question and something I do get asked like reasonably often by people. I would say one is just build a strong, like, firstly, data science is now such a large and wide field. So firstly, understand where do you want to sit within the world of analytics? Like, do you want to be a data analyst or a business analyst? Or do you want to be like, you know, a data scientist who's building models? Or do you want to be a data engineer, ML ops, ML engineering? Like there is very distinct kind of roles within that. So once you've identified, I guess, where you want to go, and if we use the example of like a traditional data scientist, that's probably building some models, building them in notebooks, getting them into production, handing them over to the data engineer or the ML engineer to actually like get out into systems. I'd say probably one thing is first just building a strong foundation and your like stats and maths and CS skills. That doesn't have to come from a degree. A degree is an easy way to do it because it's all set up for you and the government pays for it sometimes, depending on where you live. But I mean, MIT OpenCourseWare has all of their YouTube videos like available for free on linear algebra and calculus. And I certainly learned a lot of my stuff off those videos and in undergrad. And so I think that strong foundation gives you the skill set to interrogate data in a rigorous manner. But on top of that, using like personal projects as a way to gain practical programming experience. But lastly, and I think that's like largely probably congruent with most advice people would get. So I guess the one unique thing I would say is like data science actually has a lot of consequences in terms of the stuff you build. And so if you're building a model in terms of what it's doing, it's often allocating resources or rewarding people or rewarding decisions that people make. And that can influence and like change the way people behave. And so there's a whole element of recognizing the world that we live in and understanding how we got to the problems that we have today in society. So, you know, like one thing at Multitudes we do is we learn about systemic oppression of like different groups, or if you're working in a climate tech startup or something, understanding issues like climate change and diversifying your knowledge beyond the pure technical capabilities of a data scientist, I think is really important. And that could be learning about the histories of oppression or climate change or any other aspects of that human experience is really important, because I think it enables you to have a more well-rounded perspective on some of the more like new advances that you're seeing coming out. And it can be really hard to stay on top of everything. And one thing I found useful is going to like a meetup or something where you can democratize or crowdsource some of that learning, where the one in Melbourne, they'll list out like what are all the like new hot things that came out in the last like 2 months, and
cool.
You just find out what's going on from like 10 other people, and you don't actually have to or subscribe to your YouTube channel where you're curating all of that information for everyone.
So what is the meetup you go to in Melbourne?
I think it's called the ML meetup.
Nice. That's something for the viewers to know. There probably is going to be an ML or data science meetup in all types of cities around the world. I guess you started off as a data scientist in a rather unorthodox way, like today, that you would label that unorthodox, where there's no degree to learn. You kind of just walk into it, similar to how I did. But interestingly enough, a few years ago, you started doing a PhD, which some would argue is kind of, you know, the more academic way of getting into data science. So what's been your experience been like going from working to doing a PhD while also working at a startup? But I guess before you answer that, like what was your reasoning behind doing a PhD?
Yeah, sure. So the way I got to that decision was I was always reasonably like good at mathematics and statistics. So I had pretty high grades in my undergrad and in high school as well in those subjects. And so was able to get onto a PhD program comfortably, which made it a lot easier with a scholarship, I guess. the decision really came from having spent 2 or 3 years working as a data scientist in a startup, gaining these amazing commercial skills. I really wanted to round out my skill set by understanding how to do research properly and interrogate kind of things in a much more rigorous fashion, because at a startup you just don't have the breadth or the time to explore one topic in a lot of depth. And a PhD enables you to really learn how to do research properly. So that was like the motivation behind it. I also wanted to leave New Zealand and go to Melbourne, and I have a bunch of friends there. So it made it a little bit easier in terms of wanting to change the scenery in my personal life. That's kind of how I got into it. My research in itself is on investigating the strengths and weaknesses of quantum computing in terms of solving combinatorial optimization problems. The reason I did that is engineering science, which is the type of engineering I did, as a strong component of that program was in optimization and operations research. And so had a lot of familiarity with combinatorial optimization problems, and I had a physics undergrad with a strong part of that being in modern physics and quantum mechanics. And so got offered an opportunity to do it in quantum computing, which is also like a pretty new up and coming technology. So cool. And I was like, wow, fell into data science in an interesting way, and why not fall into quantum computing in an interesting way? And so I guess that's what my PhD is on, and it's looking at a framework called instance space analysis, where I'm investigating different types of optimization problems, and vehicle routing optimization is one of those ones, or constraint satisfaction is another one. And what we're looking at is understanding how can you solve those problems on different quantum hardware, but also what characteristics of an optimization problem makes them more predisposed to being solved by a certain quantum algorithm, and trying to create a mapping between a specific optimization problem, the characteristics of that problem. So if you're solving a vehicle routing problem, what's the density of the graph? What's the centricity of different aspects of your clusters? How many clusters are there? How does that help me decide what are the parameters in which I should set up my quantum algorithm? Or what's the circuit structure I should be using of a quantum circuit to do that?
First thing I almost think about there is that understanding that you're getting through your PhD could be so useful to you in being a better data scientist, where you're trying to pick which model should I actually apply for what type of problem and make that decision making. So I'm curious to hear about how concretely has your PhD helped you be a better data scientist today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one thing a PhD program teaches you to do is interrogate and critically think quite deeply about a data problem. And the more research you read, the more research you conduct, that ability to be inquisitive about a problem. When I started my PhD, I would go to a seminar and I literally didn't understand what was on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
That
makes sense.
I was going to cry because I was like, what have I got myself into? I don't even know what that symbol means.
Yeah, true.
And eventually now I can read papers and I'm like, okay, just read the math really quickly. And so
amazing.
The ability, it really pushes you to rigorously study these problems and your ability to translate customer problems into an actual mathematical model, and then really rigorously interrogate what's going on. I think that's probably the number one skill you get. And it's really important because the ability to conduct data science has become so democratized. And you can create a model in 2 lines of code. You really need to be, I think, one of the unique things that a PhD offers you is you're able to think quite critically about the inputs, the outputs, conducting error analysis, really actually looking at how the model is changing or behaving, and then understanding how to vary parameters, because putting a model in production has become easier and easier every couple of months. But actually getting a model and understanding what's going on, that's still something that requires some finesse.
Very cool. Last year, you spent some time doing a research fellowship of some sorts at NASA. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so funnily enough, when I started my PhD program, the New Zealand government offers a space scholarship where they have an agreement with the US government where they send some individuals to NASA to conduct a research fellowship, largely PhD students that go on that. So I applied to that in my first year of my PhD, and then COVID happened, and I got to the final round, and they were like, "Oh, COVID's here," and then
what a shame.
a year and a half later, I randomly get an email from the New Zealand government saying, "Hey, we're like going to kick off the program again. You were like one of our finalists last time. Do you want to come in and do the program? Like apply for the program again? And, like, you don't have." There was this huge, like, you had to write all these essay questions and like go through these interviews and all this stuff, and they're like, "We can skip all that and you just go straight to like the last round, and we can put you forward." And so I was luckily like still on their mailing list and still doing a PhD program.
Amazing.
And so I was able to go to NASA, which was and the interview went well, and was lucky enough to get the offer to go. And so I actually took sabbatical on Multitudes and did that in the US for like 6 months. And so I was working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at NASA, and they're quite famous for like the Mars rover and the Voyager mission and the Europa missions. And the whole experience was like out of a science fiction movie. The campus is just incredible. They have a Mars yard where they have like a Mars rover and like these nuclear bunkers that you can like walk around, or
wow. That's sick.
Literally like mission assembly where you can see people like creating things that are going to be going into space maybe in a year. Cool. So in terms of like the atmosphere, it was incredible, and you can go to mission control and see like real live data coming in from space, and it's wild.
Were you tempted to stay there?
I guess. Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, I think like I do want to maintain that relationship with them, because it was really fun work, and the context in which you're working is incredible. Like you're solving some of the hardest problems that humanity is facing. I do really enjoy like the liberty and autonomy you get as a startup, and like my personal like investment, I guess, within Multitudes. I'm one of the founding team members, and like that provides its own opportunity for me. But definitely like would love to maybe go back to NASA at some point and work on some really cool problems. And even the projects that I was working on when I was there were pretty awesome.
Are you allowed to talk about any of the projects?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, I can tell you the stuff I've already publicly spoken about. I was working on 2 projects. One was the Advanced Multi-Mission Operating System. It's called AMOS. And it's essentially an operating system that controls, I think, about 50 different NASA missions from JPL. And they have a core capability called the Instrumental Toolkit. And it's essentially a server that manages the telemetry data that comes from space. So all the uplink and downlink data and sequencing that comes from different JPL CubeSat missions. And a lot of my work was actually on the cloud team, migrating using Terraform and AWS to an automated deployment pipeline. So anyone working across these 50 missions, if they want to like create an improvement, they can construct their own fully like deployed version within like a AWS environment of NASA and really quickly iterate on that solution. And then the second project was a bit more of a research project, and that was looking at extreme precision radial velocities. And so trying to predict the velocity at which an exoplanet is orbiting a star. And we were looking at deep learning techniques. And the reason we were doing that is analytical techniques aren't super accurate because you can't parameterize them too well. And stellar activity is a very difficult problem due to its complexity. And the telescope data that you get is very noisy. And so what we were doing is using the sun as a training data set from Earth and trying to like use ML techniques to produce accurate measurements of radial velocities of planets and other solar systems. My work specifically was building like an experimentation architecture and also trying out different deep learning frameworks, so different models like CNN architectures, things like that, and then also improving the error analysis that we're using.
Amazing. Seems like you worked on some very cool things just in 6 months.
Yeah. And very, just like,
cool.
I want to highlight the culture that they have at NASA. It's incredible. The people are some of the smartest people on the planet, but they're super humble, really supportive. And the level of feedback that you get is also incredible. Like you'll get feedback on like specific lines of code, like why does this happen? Why does this happen? You do realize you can like use a map instead of having like 2 for loops, blah, blah, blah. And they've clearly invested in a lot in terms of creating a very honest and healthy culture that's very inclusive, and that's probably why they get to do like incredible work as well.
Now I'm very excited to start talking about Good Data Institute, which has been one of your very exciting projects on the side, along with all of the other interesting and cool things you've been doing so far. So tell us a little bit about the Good Data Institute, what your mission is, and the kind of work you're doing there.
Yeah, sure. So we're a community of about 200 plus data professionals across Australia. What we do is we design, build, and develop data capabilities for the not-for-profit sector. And so we package up data professionals into teams of volunteers, and then they go and work with a charity for a period of like 4 to 6 months where they build some sort of data capability. We work with charities of all shapes and sizes, so small organizations like Brother to Another. It's a First Nations-led initiative in the Northern Territory looking at reducing recidivism in youth, all the way to like global NGOs like the Red Cross or Bernardo's, organizations with hundreds of millions in operating budgets. I think the most inspiring thing for me is meeting these people whose entire life been dedicated to solving some of the like really tough problems in society and being able to help them and also just learn about these issues. But our mission, which you asked about, we're determined to elevate the not-for-profit sector to be leaders in the use of analytics. And like, I personally believe the private sector has somewhat failed to live up to the promise of building data products that are for purpose. That's a whole other conversation.
That's
sure
a can of worms there.
That's a big can of worms. I'll just nip it in the bud there. But I think the NGO sector has historically lacked the knowledge and skills to invest in data science, and what we're doing is really changing that.
And how can the viewers of the channel get involved with GDI?
Yeah, totally. So like firstly, just like sign up to our like LinkedIn or newsletter. We have that on our website. But the way you enter the community is we run a cohort program once a year. That's the primary gateway into the community. And it's a semi-structured component program with like a social component, an L&D component, and a hackathon with a charity that runs on for like 12 weeks. We are selective in that program, and we're typically looking for people who've already demonstrated the requisite level of data capability and professional maturity in like their day job. Because we're not teaching people, I guess, how to do data science. We're really teaching them how to apply it to charity. And saying that, we do accept anyone. We have like a blind application review process. So the community is full of people who are doing PhDs or engineers at startups, people working at FANG companies, consultants from firms like BCG or Bain. That diversity of skill set, but also diversity of demographic is really strong in the community, which is awesome.
That's
and
amazing.
We accept donations as well. So that's another way you can get involved.
No, of course. I'll leave all the links in the description below so viewers can go check out the Good Data Institute and donate or take part however they can. So I guess in summary, what's been your favorite project with the Good Data Institute? What's been a highlight?
It's really hard because some of the projects are like not sexy in terms of the work at all. Like you might be building a bunch of forms and getting them to start using the forms and building a dashboard on top of those forms. But the amount of impact that work can have on a charity, because it enables them to like report something to funders and secure significantly larger funding to accelerate and improve their impact, can be massive. All the other way, like one project we're working on right now is with a charity called Ophelia, where they're trying to enable access to researchers in low-income countries, largely in Africa, where there's very little access to machine learning skills. They want to democratize models for epidemiological research, so drug discovery and protein discovery models. Because of the latency around the internet speeds in Africa, a lot of those models can take quite long to run on the fly. And so we're building a data pipeline on AWS that's like pre-computing model predictions, storing them in a database, and they're figuring out how to really reduce that latency for someone in a low-income country in Africa to be able to access model outputs very quickly. And so in terms of like the technical aspect, that project is super cool, really cool, awesome impact as well. Everything in between. I can't say which is my favorite project because
that all sounds
they all
very
have
cool.
their own like sweet spots. I get asked that all the time as well, and I still don't have an answer.
I can imagine.
So
to some more fun questions, what do you like to do in your free time?
Yeah, like I said at the start, I love food, and so I'm very lucky to live in Melbourne. It's like one of the main foodie capitals of the world, which is great. So probably just exploring like different restaurants around the city. It's something I love to do with my friends. On weekends, I play tennis. My favorite cuisine? I'd say probably like Indian food in India is my favorite. Like
that's hard to beat.
Yeah, and then I love Japanese food as well. So it's probably Japanese is probably second. And I've been to Japan a few times. Yeah, and then I like to play tennis or golf with some mates and watch TVs and movies and travel, but don't get too much free time, sadly, right now.
That's the startup life, I guess. And do you have any favorite podcast or books to recommend to our viewers?
Yeah, definitely. So, podcasts, I listen to a bunch of like news podcasts. So, Babbage by The Economist is one that I like. I listen to the Daily Oz and the Daily from New York
Oh yeah.
Times and the Morning Report from New Zealand. There's also like the Business is Boring podcast, which is quite cool.
Mm.
Lenny's podcast is awesome for product stuff. 20VC is also a cool product for some startup stuff. And then on the books side, Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill
Oh,
is like one of my
fantastic
favorite
book.
books. Yeah. Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Capitalism versus the Climate by Naomi Klein. How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates. Both great books around climate change. And then fiction-wise, Alchemist is awesome. I mean, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan as well growing up.
Oh,
And I love a Song of Ice and Fire and like the Dune series as well. So,
so good. The Alchemist is
yeah.
definitely in my top
Don't,
3 of all times.
don't
Such
get
a good
enough
book.
time for reading. Every year I have a goal of like, oh, I want to read 10 books and I end up reading like
Yeah.
2. So,
Yeah. Tell me about it.
yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's been great talking to you, Vivek. Thanks for coming onto the channel. And as I said earlier, I'll leave all the links related to the Good Data Institute in the description below. And keen to see some more of the viewers get involved with amazing initiatives like this. So thanks a lot.
Awesome. No worries. Been great chatting to you.